Hmm. And away we go. Trying a slightly different configuration for my camera tonight. Think it's less likely to slip or move too much. Maybe. I might be a little too optimistic with that idea. All right. So yeah, I'm a little late getting here tonight because I was in the middle of trying to reach out to my nerdy friends because I came up with some ideas for some of the names, and like I had some storms last night, and I was up till probably 6 or 7 in the morning just playing around with stuff, um, and deciphering rule sets for different games that I think might work better than what I originally thought I was going to do. I think my original outline I gave last night was I should probably keep records of the things I don't. I guess these videos will have to function as that. But so my original idea for the card game possibilities was like vague because I couldn't figure out a way to maybe make that work. And then I kept going back to the fact that what I wanted to do for the card game idea was like real story. I wanted it to be a storytelling game. And I did a couple of reviews for some storytelling games a while back, a few years ago, during a November where I do National Novel Writing Month, and I did an entire week of storytelling style games that are you can purchase and play. And two of those types of games are really well configured for storytelling. One of them is called Once Upon a Time, and the other is called Nanofictionary. And like I keep wanting to go back to that model, but I couldn't figure out how to make it work for what I was doing. And so I ended I could do a rewrite of everything from Once Upon a Time as a science fiction, like a retro science fiction setting, but that didn't feel quite like what I was trying to do. Partly because half the fun of some of those retro science fiction stories are like the fact that you get these um, serial programs. So it's like the hero does such and such, and then will they survive? Tune in next week for the next thrilling adventure of. And I went, oh, I want to be able to do that. The trick with Once Upon a Time is you have a handful of cards that you're given at the beginning, and you're trying to work your way towards your happily ever after ending. And the whole thing is sort of like you can jump in the middle of the running story, um, and take over if somebody leaves it unfinished or hanging, and you can jump in if you have a card that lets you take the next step in the story that you want to build. And the goal is to bring it towards your end. And that to me seemed like the exact opposite direction of what I wanted to do for a serialized retro future ray gun gothic uh, sort of game. And it would be really really hard to figure like you'd have to engineer from scratch a way of building a gameplay that's so different from that because the mechanics can't even be reworked necessarily to do that. So what I ended up putzing around with last night is like, what other ways could I be doing this? And then I got to thinking like, well, I'm going back to my last card game that I made. My card game design was another one of those like judge, and then other players compete to try to like the judge sets something out and the other players have to compete to complete it in a way that wins the vote of the judge for each round. And so I got to thinking, okay, well, maybe that's something we can do. Like with Runcible Foods, when I made that game, it's um, the judge doesn't take from their own hand of cards. And I may May see if I can make that the way it works this time, but I feel like that's still tricky, because if everybody gets a chance to be judge, it becomes a way to dump cards and get ahead. And especially in the case of this one where I want the cards to be plot elements, characters, um, twists, or things like that, that the judge will put down 1, 2, or 3 of those that everybody else has to play and build their stories around. And then the players use their hand of cards to construct the most interesting story about the character. And so for that one, and this is what I was doing a little bit ago, is um, I think that's the one I'm going to name Captain Rita Raygun's Thrilling Interplanetary Adventures. And like part of it is like in the back of my head for like the last 48 hours, there's been the name like Rita Raygun or something like it. There's been a Rocket Rita, which I actually think is a character from Batman, where she rides like she's like a cowgirl that rides a rocket or something. I'm not sure that's a real character or not. Um, I might be misremembering that, but like Rita Raygun, uh, Rocket Rita. I thought about like Rosie Raygun. Actually, I think there is a musician by that name, or Raygun Rosie, or something like that. And then, but that name's been sitting in the back of my head, and then I got like Captain Rita Raygun, and then like I looked at some of those old pulp science fiction magazine titles, and it's like the thrilling adventures of, and interplanetary journeys of, and I think it's like Flash Gordon's interplanetary journey or something like that. And so I just started like playing around with the words and jumbling them together, and I got like Captain Rita Raygun's Thrilling Interplanetary Adventures, and I'm like, that's the perfect title. But I sort of hit up a bunch of my friends on social media and said like, some of you are like comic book nerds and pulp science fiction nerds, and I need your help. Have you ever heard of somebody? Because it sounds like a name that exists. This should be something that exists out there. Like Rita Raygun should be an existing character somewhere. If it's not, then it's perfect for what I'm doing with it. If it is, I have to change it. But Captain Rita Raygun's Thrilling Interplanetary Adventures, I think, is what I'm going to use for the card game, the storytelling card game, because the format for that is sort of like those famous tavern tales, where a bunch of it's usually done as a bunch of uh, wealthy white men who served in like the Royal Air Force or something like that, sitting around in some uh, tavern or uh, a club somewhere, sharing the stories of their, the adventures of their glory days. And I like the idea that it's the players who are telling the tavern tales of the famous Captain Rita Raygun and her thrilling interplanetary adventures. And each of those stories is what you use to use your cards up and win hands by a judge who judges which stories they like the best. Um, so I think that's the way I'm going to go with the card game, which, I mean, that one's so thoroughly, mostly fleshed out at this point that I should really be able to start to build a custom, like I'll get some index cards at Walmart or something and build out an entire deck of plot elements and characters and MacGuffins and event cards that can be used to set some of that up. And then I should be able to play test. I don't imagine I'll be able to play test this week, getting together with anybody to do some playtesting is probably going to be really difficult. But I think I can assemble a roughly, based off of my experience with this format of game design, I think I should be able to rough out a basic playable. There may be some adjustments because, like with Runcible Foods, you start with a hand of 3 cards, and you always draw 2 at the end of every turn. In this case, if somebody lays down like a villain, a MacGuffin, and a plot card, if the judge lays down those 3 things and you have only 3 cards in your hand, it makes for a weak story. So I feel like it's going to have to be like you get a really large hand of cards to start with. And so this deck may be really big. Yeah, I did a search for Rita Raygun, and the only one I saw Rita Raygun on Facebook, and there wasn't anything I could see about whoever that is. I did an image search, and I did I changed it around to Raygun Rita versus Rita Raygun. I did, and I did Raygun all one word. I didn't try Raygun 2 words. And I did find at one point one of the searches returned like a Google Books a word, like the name Rita Raygun, or maybe even Rosie Raygun. I did a lot of searches on those names together, and one of them turned up as just like a throwaway phrase in a short story in an anthology that I don't think went anywhere. I went on to Amazon and typed in Rita Raygun to see if I could, any books about a character like that came up, or any movies or anything that might have been like that. And I got nothing. So I think I'm probably good there. So but it sounds like a name of a character that should already exist, doesn't it? It's just sort of like I'm listening. When I think about it, it's like somebody's got to have given a character that name by now. It sounds like it's something that should already exist, and maybe that's because they're similar things, and it just sounds familiar. Like we have the tendency to think there's a somewhat famous example of a movie that people imagine Sinbad versus Shaquille O'Neal did as a genie of some kind, and we almost all remember it wrong, which is hilarious. But so I wonder if there's some element of that at play here. But and I got to thinking when I was naming this one and figuring this out, like I figured out how I think I want to work the board game as well as the card game. The board game's a little more tricky and more involved, and it may take a little more time. But I'm looking at the design for the board game to be something like uh, a sort of a free movement board that you can move along certain paths pretty evenly. It's sort of like the game that I talked about, the Vampire Hunter game that I did talk about last night, I think. Part of that game is you have a map of the castle of the vampire, and you can walk in straight lines or move around the rooms of the vampire's castle. There's straighter paths, and there are more move around certain objects kind of thing. And along the way, there are things that you can come across that may end up being an encounter or an object or an event of some kind. And that aspect I think would be good to do a whole map of, like the solar system. So it would be like Mercury, Venus, Earth, Moon, Mars, asteroids, Jupiter and its moons, Saturn and its moons, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and maybe the comets out on the outside. And all along those maps can be little tiles, like in the Vampire Hunter game, that you don't know what they are until you land on them and flip them over. And flipping them over could be you get an object or some kind of event, and so you'd have a deck of event cards or something off to the side. But also have the possibility of it being like a villainous base, and or setting up a villainous base. Like, here's a clue that tells you, if you land on the South Pole of Mars, that you'll find the secret base of villain A. And there's another game that I just discovered a couple days ago that I was looking at as potentially figuring out some new interesting mechanics, and it's called 5 Minute Dungeon. And 5 Minute Dungeon has a gameplay where essentially you have a placard, which is a boss monster, and then on top of that placard, the placard is a picture of the character and some icons that you have to match from your hand to beat them. And so it's like a sword, a shield, magic, arrows, and physical, like a running or a combat or something like that. And so there are 5 categories of images that you would use. You could easily do it as like change it over to a earth, air, wind, fire, water, spirit kind of thing, and you could do like a whole Captain Planet themed game or something like that. But regardless, there are 5 different types of images that you have a deck of cards with some of those images. Some could be wild, some could be a sword and a shield, some could be double swords, whatever. And you're working with other players to, in a time limit, lay out a set of those images to try to defeat that villain. But the villain placard with the things that you need to beat him is also a placard on which a small deck of cards, and they tell you how many cards goes on top of it, and they call them door cards or whatever. And it's supposed to represent the dungeon you have to go through to get to the mini boss. And so, like, I think the first one was in the review I saw was Baby Barbarian was the boss, and that had 20 cards that you put on top of it. And so to get through the dungeon, to get to the mini boss, you had to flip over the cards, and each card was like an obstacle, what was it? It was an obstacle, a person, or a monster, I think were the 3 of them. And I think there was another category where you include a limited number of them based on how many players you have, and it was just like a random event card. And so it would be like, you were injured, or something like that. I can't even remember some good examples of it. But the idea of that, all those pieces working together, I would have to tweak some of them, because the way they do 5 Minute Dungeon is you download an app on your phone. I'm like, nope, don't want to do it. I don't want people pulling out their phones and putting them on the tables or using them as things to do anything on this game with. I want this game self-contained. You don't need the internet. You don't need a smartphone. You don't need any mechanical things. You don't need any batteries. None of that garbage. I don't want any of that involved in my game. But if I tweak those mechanics a little bit to get if I get a turn-based version of something like that, where again you have the placard for the boss villain of that episode, and on that boss villain's base card you have the doors or the things you have to get through to get to the boss. And you have to flip through those, and you have to play from your hand to defeat them. I like that mechanic as a means of putting like a Ming the Merciless or some other villain or monsters or an alien invasion or giant space slug or something that I can put at different locations around the solar system for the players to play at. And with that kind of idea, the question then becomes, what's your motivation as player? And I feel like it would be fun. The other thing about 5 Minute Dungeon that they do is each player chooses a character class. So it would be like the gladiator or the paladin or the ninja or the thief or the sorceress. And each of those has a playing advantage. So like the thief can discard 3 cards to draw 5 cards, whereas I think the paladin could discard 3 cards to destroy any monster. And so they each have a talent that they can use. And I like the fact of like creating a character like that with a talent, but also I like the idea of combining. I think this is a game called Small Worlds or something like that, where you start out with a race of beings that you are playing, and it would be the race of dwarves, and then there's a tile that slots in with those, so it's like the necromancer dwarves, and so necromancer gives you a talent, a capability, and the dwarves give you some other feature where you benefit from mountains or something like that. I'd have to look back into that game, but I like the idea of having a like a placard for each character who wants to play the game to play a Venusian rocketeer or a Martian rocketeer or an Earth-based or a Mercury or from the planet of Ganymede, the moon of Ganymede. So you can play any one of these different races of characters, but also have like a small deck of cards with win scenarios. What you're going to try to achieve to win for your character. And that way, like different characters could be playing towards different goals. And you can help each other or you could fight each other. And sometimes you could betray each other. So I got to figure out like where the right balance to achieve that is. And I feel like basing my motion for gameplay in that, I'm looking at a game. I was watching some reviews last night for Eldritch Horror, where the turn base is action phase, encounter phase, and the I guess we'd call it the villains phase if we were to do that. And basically, it's like you decide if you're going to do rest and recovery, repairs, or something like that, and whether or not you move, and that's action phase. And then the encounter phase is finding out what's happening at the location. And then the villain phase is something dark happens to set the next section of the story and act and underway. And so I feel like some of that design and watching some of the play of Eldritch Horror, and Eldritch Horror, I may have to go rewatch some of that gameplay to get a sense for how it works. And I know there's a gaming store down here where I may be able to try out Eldritch Horror and just look through the game and get a better sense for how it works. Because I don't think I can use the way they do it. Because my understanding of the design of that game is it's got like booklets of stories and legends and like different decks for different types of games. So like in game 1 where you're playing this character and you're opposing this evil god, and this series of events takes place, like then you use this deck of cards, and I'm like, already way more complicated than I want this to be. I want multiple playability with just the base set. We can add expansions and fun stuff later on. That's fine. I don't mind that. But I don't want this to be like, if you've already played through it this way once, then you can't play that game again anymore. You have to get a new pack or a new set of different scenarios. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to play that way. So I'm going to look at like the phases of action that players can take from Eldritch Horror for figuring out navigating the map, and then base the map more off the Vampire Hunter style board, but based on a solar system instead, and then use the villain base encounters based off of the 5-minute dungeon with elements of cooperative and competitive gameplay all at once. And so that's a lot of pieces to get to work right, I think. But I think I got a rough idea of how to do that, and almost guaranteed that the first 2 or 3 rounds of play of this game, we're going to find holes. I'm going to have to figure out how to patch them to get them to work cleanly together. And I'll have to rewrite a lot of the rules because like some of the stuff of the 5-minute dungeon, like it's based off of a timer, and I don't want a timer combat. And it's multiple players working together, whereas I want it to be possible for a player playing solo to be able to defeat a boss at his base. So you could have Captain Chip Beefchin or whatever you want to call him. I don't know why I keep making such stupid names, but Captain Chip goes up and confronts the Amazon Moon Pirates. That's an idea from a video game that I will be working on at some other point. But confronts the Amazon Moon Pirates, and so has to go through their pirate base on the moon, and has to confront different monsters or like gun emplacements or robot minions at the moon base. And so that would be you move to the base, that would be a movement phase, or an action phase, and then after that you would have a encounter phase, and you get like your turn and the monster's turn back and forth until one of you wins. And then it's possible to do an overarching storyline where there's a mastermind behind all the action in the solar system, and you can set it up so that the villainous action phase from Eldritch Horror would be, the plan is progressing. And I might build that as like a separate deck, which is a totally different mechanic than anybody's used for this, as far as I can tell. And you do a small deck of assembling a master plan for dominating the solar system or whatever. And each time that phase comes up, there's a, take from that deck and flip over and see how far that villainous plan is progressing. So I think that's sort of what I'm going to do for both of those styles of games. I think I made a fair amount of progress on these games last night. These ideas. I wasn't sure what I was going to name the board game so much, because for a little second, if it looks like I'm going to be able to get away with using Captain Rita Raygun, I may make them both Captain Rita Raygun games. And I kind of like the idea of being able to do that. I just haven't figured out how to name it. Is it like the Cosmic Adventures of Captain Rita Raygun or something like that? Because it's the first one, the card game, I think makes the most sense, where it's Captain Rita Raygun's Thrilling Interplanetary Adventures, which I think makes the most sense for storytelling. Yeah. So I like that name. I like the idea of making both games themed on the main character of Captain Rita Raygun. I just have to I have to go back through some of those titles of like the the Wikipedia article for the history of US science fiction and fantasy magazines to 1950. And looking through some of these things, uh, there's as you get further down in the article, there's a section called List of Magazines. This table provides the following information: title, first and last issue, publisher, number of issues, new or reprint, and notes about different magazines published in the golden age of science fiction. And so it's the Thrill Book, Weird Tales, Amazing Stories Annual, Tales of Magic and Mystery, Ghost Stories, Amazing Stories Quarterly, Air Wonder Stories. A lot of them have things like Science Wonder Stories and Wonder Stories Quarterly, Astounding Stories, Scientific Detective Monthly, and stuff like that. Miracle Science and Fantasy Stories. Strange Tales, Dr. Death, Thrilling Wonder Stories. And so, like, just taking a bunch of these and playing around with the titles of them and see if I can pull together something that would work for a name on this. But if I do that, I also I'm still wondering if it makes sense for. I mean, I think it probably is a good idea to go with the Rita Raygun, Captain Rita Raygun name on it. And I would love, love to see if track down some artists who could do some truly amazing, some of that Raygun Gothic, almost like pinup art, not quite pinup. I don't want it to be like pinup art, but that style of look, where it's got the retro spacesuits and the ray guns and the rocket ships, but it's like a portraiture of characters. And I think that art style could be amazing. And you're going to use a lot of streamlined modern, a little bit of Googie, and some Art Deco styling to it. And it'd be gorgeous if I could get really good art done for this. Now, these are going to be like, if I do that, I may have to accept the fact that the first versions are going to be simpler artwork. But I do want to do like a really good version 2.0, where I want to do like sort of like, oh, I just can't think of another example. Like, it's hard to like, some of the covers to some of those old magazines would be the closest equivalent that I can imagine of what I'm sort of talking about. Like the old covers of a science fiction magazine. But like see if I can pull up an image here and post a link to it. Gothic. Or actually I can probably well, I don't know. That might be I was going to point the camera at any image search that I pulled up, but that's a risk of copyright anybody. But I will see if I can find a decent piece of artwork that I could link to. Like I really dig so copy image address, I guess. And see if that works here. Pull that off to the side and Control V. Yeah, so essentially, I think what I'm going for, like, I can imagine artwork for this game that's something like this. That would be like the character placards or the villains or the monsters. Get them all to look something a little bit like that. That would be some of the art style that I would favor. Or the board game, especially. The card game could be a little simpler, a little more cartoony, I guess. I don't know why that broke that in half. It should have been one statement. Alrighty, but yeah, so I really dig that sort of art style, and I think that could be kind of fun. It's such fun playing around with that. That sort of look. But yeah, I think like an art style like that for like different characters that you could play on the board game, and then like so it would be the villains, each of the playable characters, some of the monsters, and then the rest of it can be sort of like obstacles can be just like pictures of traps and like the solar system pictures could be I could even set up a model solar system and take pictures of it and make it look like uh like if you've ever seen some of the old Flash Gordon TV programs where they have this toy rocket with a firecracker in the back or like a cannon fuse and you light it and it's spitting sparks out the back. I could that could be so much fun to just play with. The art style would be just a fun experiment to try to do. But yeah, I think I've started to nail down the rule systems that I want for both of them. And who would have thought that I would have gotten this far and still wouldn't have figured out which one's going to be my main one? I may end up finishing two of them by the end of the month. But yeah, Captain Rita Raygun's thrilling and interplanetary adventures, and the other thing I'm thinking about with the design of some of this is like the card game, the Captain Rita's Raygun's thrilling and interplanetary adventures card game. All of the mechanics for that could very easily be converted to do other types of pulp science fiction and fantasy. So I could very easily turn this over into a shadow style superhero vigilante character, or something sort of like the what was it, the Johnny Quest stories and stuff like that, or even like an Indiana Jones, or stuff like that. All of those are options that, with just changed cards, but all the rules and mechanics, it's like reskinning it for a different style. It's like you can take taking a World of Warcraft and reskinning it all to be science fiction instead of fantasy. You could totally do it. And so, like, I could do multiple pulp games off of that one design. I I feel like Rita Raygun's thrilling interplanetary adventures kind of has to be all about Captain Rita Raygun. Um, but if I make a pulp card game inspired by this, I could make it so that you could combine an Indiana Jones and a Johnny Quest and the Phantom and the Shadow, and do all of those types of stories in one game as expansion packs that you add and interact with. And so you could have Indiana Jones confronting the Phantom or something like that. Like, I could build a game that did all that. I don't think Captain Rita Raygun fits in the rest of that. So I think I'm doing this one as a standalone right now. I might figure out a way at a later date to make it possible to include them. But I mean, that one's Captain Rita Raygun's is very science fiction. It's interplanetary science fiction. It's harder to do like a supernatural, um, like a ghost or other stories on, you know, 1930s to 1950s Earth, um, with superheroes and magic and stuff like that. It doesn't work as well with the Raygun Gothic aesthetic and story type. But as a dry run for figuring out how to do pulp stories in a card game, I think that'd be a pretty good dry run. And then the board game, I don't know that there's as easy a way to make a reskin on that one. That one's set up pretty well to be just an interplanetary Flash Gordon-y kind of game. I suppose if you redid the map, instead of a solar system, you did it as an island, and instead of alien monsters, you did I bet you could probably do like a spaghetti western, like kung fu movies. You could probably pull that off. Or a pirate game. Yeah, you might be able to reskin it, but it's not going to be as pulpy as the card game is likely to be. I don't think it translates to other forms of pulp as well. And because a lot of those pulp stories, like the Amazing Stories and those types of things, they're linear storylines, and the board game that I'm working on right now is a little bit more. It's an adventure, almost a role play. And so it doesn't have the rails that you ride along from start to finish for your pulp story. But let's build this one and figure out if it's expandable later. Figure out what else we could do with it. I'm actually really kind of enthusiastic about this now, because thinking about it, really, like, when I design this card game and when I finish this board game, the possibility of doing reskins of them and making 6 or 7 different other themed games, oh, that would be so cool. I could funnel a little bit of the first sales of the game over into funding art for different versions and get different styles, different themes. I wonder if I can do a cowboy version. It might be a little harder. Ooh, I wonder if that's a weird thought. Like, I'm just thinking of different genres now, and I'm like, a genre that I have very little experience in and not a lot of interest in. But I wonder if you could do like a romance novel board game. I'll have to talk with some of my friends online who are writers in that genre and get their sense about it. That would be weird. I don't know how you would pull that off. I'd have to really consult with somebody like that. But I imagine that would be sort of just a fun, dorky thing to try out and explore. I don't know. I'll think about it. So if I can get these systems worked out, get the rules figured out, I think both of these are going to be robust enough games that I could do some very interesting things with them in the future. Like, even to the point of taking those games, breaking them, and putting them together in new ways to get an entirely new game. I get so excited when I get into projects like this. And they're just such fruitful playgrounds to do things in. Okay, so I gotta do a little research in and tonight to get a little more sense about how the turn-based actions are done in Eldritch Horror. Gotta track down my copy of Vampire Hunter for the tile encounter base. And I may order a copy of 5 Minute Dungeon so I can do a little practice in seeing if I could turn it into a turn-based rather than a timer-based system, and if I can break down the if I can break down the system of card play into a way that makes sense for what I'm trying to do. I did debate for a little bit whether or not I wanted to change that from cards, where like the 5 Minute Dungeon is just cards, where you play those cards against icons. You need to get a match for each of those. I thought about turning those over into dice or tiles. Now I was kind of curious about tiles would be a bit cumbersome. It's just at that point they're just cards that are thick and chunky. But I feel like with dice, it's almost like doing Yahtzee, where you try to roll a set number of 2s, 3s, and 5s. But if I take the dice and alter them from numbers to ideograms, images, hieroglyphics, if you will, if I can change them over to 5 different types of hieroglyphics, you roll It might be something along the lines of you roll all the dice and you keep 2, and then you roll again, you keep 2, and you roll the last one again, and you can keep that one. You have to keep that one, and that counts as 1 turn. And if we're doing that, we may want to have a health counter for the player card, the placard. And if we do that, that may take you multiple rounds to defeat the dungeon and the boss there. And you may get to a point where it looks like you can't defeat the dungeon or the boss. You can flee and come back and try again another time, but the dungeon will be repopulated again, so you have to start over. But that might not be a bad way to do that. I might switch from cards to dice. So each player would get their own set of dice for their character. And I'd want to do like a Venusian, a moon person, Earthling, Mars, maybe Mercury, Jovian of some kind. So one of the moons of Jupiter. And, somebody from the moons of Saturn. I don't know about whether or not I should do. How many aliens should I do? Should I do one for each of the one type of alien for each of the 9 planets? And I'm counting Pluto as a planet. But maybe. I mean, I don't know that it would hurt to do 9. And it could make for some interesting possibilities. Looking at it, like the abilities that the characters in 5-Minute Dungeon had were monster, person, obstacle, so defeat monster, person, or obstacle. And I think there were like 4 special abilities besides that. So I could do at least 7. If I did the moon as a separate one, it might be 10. I don't know that I would want to do separate moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Maybe what I need to do is start with Mercury, Venus, Earth, Moon, and Mars, and have expansions that I can add later. I think that makes a fair amount of sense. So, and that would be advantages against monsters, against people, against obstacles, and I could do like 1 or 2 other advantages. So like the thief's advantage is discard 3 cards and gain 5. So something equivalent for a race would be something I could add. So that's, I think I'm switching the cards out for dice. How am I going to handle motion on the board, though? Like, I like the idea of the the placards for the big bosses and the cards for the obstacles and the minions, or events, and dice for the combat. How are we handling motion? Does everybody's ship have a set? Perhaps. I think it makes a reasonable amount of sense that like the Earth ship moves at movement rate 4. The Venusian ship moves at movement rate 3. You know, stuff like that. But if I do that, I'm going to have to do a lot of play testing to see if doing different movement rates puts anybody at a major disadvantage in gameplay. And if so, are there ways to change that, or if it just makes more sense to give everybody the same movement rate? So now I got to think about movement on the board, and I'll have to figure that one out. I'll look into what movements like an Eldritch Horror Vampire Hunter, and the 5-minute dungeon doesn't really have a movement. So trying to think what other games are similar to this style of game. All right. Well, I'm sitting here. I'm starting to get dead sound here, where I'm sitting here thinking quietly to myself, and I think that's as good a place as any to call it for the night. I will come back tomorrow with more updates, and hopefully, we will learn more about Captain Rita Raygun's adventures in space. All right. See you tomorrow. Have a good one. Take care. All right.